Hello everyone and welcome back to TowerGate. It is TowerGate day 512. 512, day 512, August the 6th, 2018, Monday. Thank you so much for tuning in. Yes, we had a wonderful weekend camping. We left on Friday morning around 11 o'clock and came back Sunday evening. Beautiful time, beautiful the woods. It was just absolutely great. It was a non-digital weekend for the most part. I think the kiddies may have cheated, but for the most part, we got away from the digital devices, just got lost out in the woods. We didn't rough it. We weren't out there in pup tents. I rented a camper. So we ate really good, by the way. We ate really good, slept really good, did a lot of hiking, a lot of biking, did some canoeing. Just had a really good weekend, chance just to get away, get out in the woods and just enjoy it. And the Hocking Hills is a great place to go for hiking. It's probably the best hiking and biking place that you can go to in this area. So anyway, we had a great time, and it's good to be back on the beat, I guess you might say. So anyway, the main thing I'm going to focus on in today's video is going to be what the most recent ruling, and in fact the two most recent rulings in the BuzzFeed case, because a new ruling just came down on Friday. Now the previous ruling came down about 2 weeks ago. And what's interesting about this BuzzFeed case is there's about 2 or 3 different federal judges that have made rulings based on motions brought by both sides, both Mr. Gubarev's side and BuzzFeed's side. Now, for those of you who are kind of new to my TowerGate videos, I don't want to lose you here, so I'll do a little background for you, so you don't get lost, because this gets a little tricky. It's going to get a little wild, so you have to try to stay with me. But you got to understand where this, how this began before you'll. Otherwise, you just won't understand what I'm talking about. Okay, so for those of you who are just kind of new to TowerGate, when the dossier was published, the final memo, which in fact is in the last 2 paragraphs of the dossier, stated that a company called XBT Holdings and Webzilla was responsible for doing the physical hacking of the DNC. The company is, of course, owned by a man named Alexei Gubarev. Now, Mr. Gubarev, of course, vehemently denies that his companies, Webzilla and XBT Holdings, did any such thing, that they did not hack the DNC on behalf of Putin, the Russians, or anybody else. And so, therefore, Mr. Gubarev filed a libel suit against BuzzFeed in Florida, and he filed a libel suit against Christopher Steele in London. So these 2 libel cases have been going on now for about 1.5 years, and there's been a lot of fighting back and forth from the 2 different attorneys representing the 2, doing their thing. Now, if you look at the rulings, as we've been following this case very closely, because it's very important, it's a civil case, but a lot of the questions that we have about Spygate, or whatever you want to call it, the frame-up, the coup, whatever you want to call it, a lot of the questions and a lot of the witnesses and a lot of the evidence that we're interested in is very likely to come out in these civil cases long before it ever comes out of D.C., where the congressional committees are being stonewalled and all that sort of thing. Well, in a civil case, it doesn't quite work that way. The judge rules you got to stand for deposition, you got to produce documents, you got to do it. You don't have Rod Rodenstein in there, throwing a wrench in the spokes. So that's why I've watched the cases, and we've learned a lot from these cases in these 2 civil cases. And these 2 civil cases are going to be, the one in the BuzzFeed case in Florida will resume in November. And as a result of the last 2 rulings by 2 different judges, we're going to be learning a lot of things that we want to get to the bottom of about the dossier, Christopher Steele, the government's role, DNC, the whole 9 yards. So, anyway, that is kind of what we're going to be talking about for most of this video. The major part of this video today is the last 2 rulings by federal judges in the cases of the libel cases of Mr. Gubarev versus Christopher Steele in London and Mr. Gubarev versus BuzzFeed in Florida. Because remember, BuzzFeed was the media organization that published the dossier, which claimed that Mr. Gubarev's company was the ones who did this hacking. And of course he denies it, so therefore he sued them. So now BuzzFeed has to prove, if they want to win their case, that Mr. Gubarev's company did the hacking. And in the case of Christopher Steele, he has to prove that the things he said in the dossier are either A, true, or that B, he's not responsible because he told BuzzFeed not to publish it, or that he didn't have any role in it becoming published. So that's the defense he is using. Okay, so this latest ruling, and by the way, the information I'm about to give you is coming from lawandjustice.com and the Washington Times. So the latest ruling in the BuzzFeed case went in favor of BuzzFeed versus the government. So BuzzFeed had filed a motion with the federal judge against the government, trying to force the government to testify and produce documents and evidence that would back up their case. So the U.S. government has now must answer questions about its handling of the so-called dossier in court. They must sit for deposition. They must produce documents and evidence. So this was Federal District Court Judge Amit P. Mehta, M-E-H-T-A, who made this ruling just this past Friday. That means that Comey, Yates, Clapper, Brennan, Strzok, and others are likely to be called for deposition as well as to be provide testimony in court. Now, this is a different judge than the one who just made a major ruling in favor of a motion by Mr. Gubarev's attorneys, which was the week before, or 2 weeks before. That judge was Ursula Ungaro. And that judge stated that Confusion GPS must turn over all communications between them and everyone they communicated with about the dossier, which would include anyone in the government or Christopher Steele or anyone else. All employees of Confusion GPS must be deposed and testify if subpoenaed. Basically, what we have here is that the judges ruling in this case are basically trying to do essentially a deposition of the dossier itself. For them to make a ruling on the case, they have to understand what the hell the dossier is. Who created it? Why they created it? Is it true? How much of it's true? 5%, 10%, 50%? Did the government actually investigate it? Did they actually take it seriously? Was it actually newsworthy? All these types of questions have to be answered, and so it appears that the 3 federal judges who have ruled on motions in this case all are in agreement about one thing, and that is, in order to get to the truth and wrap up this civil case, the 2 civil cases, both in London and in Florida, they are going to have to know who did what about the dossier. A lot of the questions, a lot of the things that we need to know, and the efforts that are going by the Congress in the various committees, with Nunes's committee, the Oversight Committee with Goodlatte, the Judicial Committee with Grassley, all these committees are trying to get the same exact answers that the judges are trying to get to the bottom of in the civil cases. That's why it's important, and that's why I've been following them. Now, the case in the BuzzFeed case will resume again in November. I'm not sure what the status is on the Steele case in London. I don't know if it's in recess or if it's going to resume in November again as well. But I know the BuzzFeed case will resume in November, and when it does, the government and agents of the government, which could be Comey, Strzok, Page, the whole 9 yards, McCabe, all the rest, they could be called for deposition and testimony. So, here's what we have. Based on the last 2 rulings, BuzzFeed, Confusion GPS, Christopher Steele, and the government must all provide, must all be deposed. They must all be able to be called for subpoena. They must turn over documents and records and various other things ordered by the court. So, what they have to prove is that Mr. Gubarev's firms, Webzilla and XBT Holdings, did what they are accused of doing in the dossier, which is the final 2 paragraphs in the dossier, which came from the final memo, the 17th memo. That is where the allegations are made against Mr. Gubarev's companies, Webzilla and XBT Holdings, which, of course, they provide web hosting services for companies around the globe. It's a very large company that Mr. Gubarev owns. So, we had the other ruling that was a ruling. See, this most recent ruling was a motion requested by BuzzFeed's lawyers. But the previous ruling, which is now going to force the government to come in and show what they got and what they know about the dossier and what they were involved in and who they were involved with the dossier. But the previous ruling of 2 weeks ago was a motion brought by Gubarev's attorneys, and they wanted the same thing to be done to Fusion GPS and the Democratic National Committee. And the judge in that ruling ruled for Mr. Gubarev, which is basically ruled in favor, saying that the Democratic National Committee must provide all evidence that supports the accusations against Mr. Gubarev, and must also sit for deposition and testify in court if subpoenaed. And that means it could include Debbie Blabbermouth Wasserman Schultz, the Rotten Reverend Clinton, and others. They have to produce the stuff put together by CrowdStrike. They have to produce any other forensic evidence they have. Basically, because Confusion GPS and the Democratic National Committee are on board with this idea that the dossier is true and that Mr. Gubarev's company was involved, they now have to prove it in civil court. And that's why the judge ruled. So now they got to do the whole 9 yards. Depositions, produce documents, evidence, the whole 9 yards. They'll be subpoenaed to come and testify as well. So let's try to sort through this a little bit because it's now getting kind of confusing. So BuzzFeed now will have to will now have the government giving deposition and testimony as part of their defense, and Mr. Gubarev will have Fusion GPS and the Democratic National Committee providing depositions, documents, and testimony on their behalf. So what we have here is, we see that what's going on here is that the judges in this case, in this civil case, have determined that in order for them to render a decision here, they have to know everything about the dossier. So they're essentially going to have a deposition of the dossier. And that means everyone that has any information about the dossier, how it's put together, how it was disseminated, who talked to who did what, the whole 9 yards. And so to do that, you have to have all the entities that were involved in creating it and disseminating it. And that would be the Democratic National Committee, the government, Christopher Steele, and Confusion GPS. They all are going to be deposed. They all are going to have to stand for testimony in court, and they all are going to have to produce records and documents, forensic evidence, and anything else they have. They got to lay it all out there, and it's all going to come out in the civil case, which will resume in November in Florida. Now, the testimony of the government officials ordered by Judge Mehta does seal those testimonies from the public record. In other words, as part of this most recent ruling, he did say, yeah, the government has to come in and tell us everything that they were involved in. Comey, McCabe, been stroking us, the whole 9 yards. They got to tell us all about what they were doing with the dossier. Probably includes Bruce Orr, Nellie Orr, and the whole 9 yards. But it is going, but their testimonies and their documents are going to be sealed from the public. We're not going to know. The only two people who are going to know, well, the three entities that will know initially until it's given to the jury, will be the judge and the two attorneys in the case. They are the only ones whose eyes will see it. Now, how does that affect the congressional investigations? Okay, well, as far as the Department of Justice is concerned, the Department of Justice is able to look at information in a civil case. If there's a civil case going on and the Department of Justice has an interest in what's going on with that civil case, the DOJ is allowed to go in and look at those sealed documents, testimonies, whatever. All that stuff that's sealed from the public is not sealed from the DOJ. They are able to look at it, even though it's a civil case, not a criminal case, but the Department of Justice can still, they have the authority to look at anything, the sealed evidence, even if it's a civil case. Now, Congress, I don't think they automatically have, in fact, I'm sure they do not, but they probably will be able to get subpoenas to look at that stuff. So Nunes's committee, Grassley's committee, Goodlatte's committee, the DOJ can just look at it. But those three committees will probably want to have a look at all the things that are coming out in these depositions and evidence and things in the BuzzFeed case. But they'll probably have to go through a subpoena process to get that information. And we won't learn about it for farther down the road. But it will certainly benefit the committees looking into this stuff in Congress. Now, the way this happens, because this is not unusual. In fact, if you go look at the law on this, you'll see that this has happened hundreds of times in our history, where a civil case becomes a criminal case, or most often a criminal case results in a civil case. The most obvious would have been O.J. Simpson, whereas O.J. Simpson was acquitted on criminal charges, but after he was acquitted on criminal charges, the plaintiffs filed a civil suit and they won in the civil suit. Okay? That's what happens 90% of the time. But now, every now and then, you'll have a situation where you have a civil case going on. And the civil case will turn into a criminal case. Now, how does that work? Okay, here's what normally happens. There's a civil case going on. But there may be something going on with that civil case that a county prosecutor was looking into in regards to a criminal investigation. But maybe they just did not have enough evidence to move forward or file indictments or begin, having the process of the criminal prosecution. So they're really not able to do anything. But then all of a sudden, a civil case takes off. So what will happen usually is the county prosecutor will watch the civil case. They'll watch and watch and watch, and they'll look at the information that's coming out in the civil case. And if some information that comes out in the civil case is something that they look at and say, uh-oh, this is stuff that if we would have had in our criminal investigation would have given us everything we needed to go ahead and pursue the criminal indictments. We just didn't have this information, but now it's come out in civil court. So what will happen almost all the time, what will happen is the county prosecutor will then go to the judge in the civil case and say, hey, this civil case that you're doing, we've been investigating a criminal case of this, but we really didn't have this information that you've got that's come out in your civil case. But since it has come out in your civil case and we now have it, we are going to move forward with our criminal investigation. We're going to seek indictments, whatever. And so therefore, we're going to be taking this case as a criminal matter. So what happens then is the judge in the civil case will call a hearing, they'll bring in all the parties, and he'll announce that they're going to have a stay, and meaning that we're going to stop the civil proceedings. They're going to stop because now there's a criminal investigation that's been opened or indictments may be coming down, and so they yield to the criminal case. So then the criminal case will begin, and then once the criminal case has been completed, then they can go back and reopen or resume the civil matter. Now, every now and then, very rarely, but it does happen, again, there's court cases that this has happened in, there'll be a civil case that's going on, and no county prosecutors will be paying attention at all. They won't have any interest at all or know anything at all, but something will come out in the civil case, and it'll be, in the media or something, and some prosecutor will look at that and go, wow, that came out in that civil case? What, weren't we looking into some criminal matter regarding that a while back? At which point they'll be kind of digging through it, but at some point the people in the civil case, the judge or one of the lawyers or any officer of the court, if they realize during a civil proceeding that there may be a criminal a violation of a criminal code, they are ethically obligated as officers of the court to go to the authorities, which would generally be a county prosecutor or the FBI or the local police or whatever, and say, hey, we're in this civil case and some information has come out which I think may be of a criminal nature, that there might be violations of criminal code, and so you may want to take a look at this, at which point it's the civil officers of the civil court, whether it's the judge, the lawyers, or anyone else, have to go to the law enforcement and say, hey, we've uncovered some things in the civil case that we think might be criminal. At which point, then the criminal prosecutors, the whatever, will take a look at it, and if they say, yeah, we agree, these things are probably violations of criminal code, I think we better make this a criminal investigation, at which point, again, you get a stay in the civil case, and the criminal case will take over and move forward. Once it's completed, then they can go back to the civil case. Okay, so that's how this could affect everything that's happening with the overall Spygate, or whatever you want to call it, Obamagate, TowerGate, whatever you want to call it, the deep state coup. These things all come into play. So what's going on in the civil cases is very important, and we will be watching very closely, as I have been for over a year and a half now. So, is this going to work for BuzzFeed? Is calling this most recent ruling by the judge allowing BuzzFeed to bring in for deposition people from the government, which would be Comey or McCabe or whoever, Bruce or whoever had any dealings with the dossier, is bringing these people in. Is this going to help BuzzFeed win the case? Well, not just, okay. alone, no. Even if Comey or McCabe or the government comes in and says, yeah, we looked at the dossier, we saw Mr. Gubarev's name and his companies and stuff like that, and in the last memo of the dossier, and we did investigate that, we did take a look at it, and we determined that we couldn't prove any of that, didn't know about any of that. So, and then we looked at the CrowdStrike stuff, and they say it was the Russian intelligence, the GRU. And so, whether or not the GRU was using Mr. Gubarev or not, we don't have any evidence that would connect us to that. So we really can't say. And that's probably what we're going to get. Because if they did have evidence that Mr. Gubarev was in any way, shape, or form involved, it certainly would have come out by now. I mean, with all the documents we've had released, the IG report says nothing about Mr. Gubarev, Webzilla, or XBT Holdings. Nothing from the FBI releases. You don't hear it coming out in any congressional committees. It's just never been heard of. Not only that, Mr. Gubarev himself says he has never been contacted in any way, shape, or form. Not by phone, not by letter, not by email, not in person, by anyone from the government regarding this matter. He's never been even contacted, never even been questioned. The FBI has never even come and said, hey, you know, you're in the dossier as being the guy that did the hacking. You want to tell us about that? Mr. Gubarev says never has he had a single conversation. He's never been approached by anyone from the government, Department of Justice, FBI, or anyone else about the fact that his company and he was being blamed for doing the physical hacking of the DNC. Never even been contacted. Not a single peep. And that doesn't bode well for BuzzFeed. But even if, let's just say the government comes in and fully backs BuzzFeed and says, oh yeah, man, we totally believe that Gubarev's involved. We totally believe that his companies did this for Putin. We just haven't been able to find the proof, but we're working on it. You know, now if they said that, that might move the jury a little bit. But it still doesn't win the case for BuzzFeed, because BuzzFeed ultimately has to prove that it is true. And the government, unless Comey or McCabe or someone can sit down in the witness stand and produce the documents and the evidence to the judge in the case and to the jury and say, yep, we got the proof, it was Gubarev and XBT Holdings and Webzilla, they're the ones who did the hacking for the Russians, and we got the evidence. That ain't gonna happen. We already know that ain't gonna happen, okay? So this is, I don't know if this is a delay tactic by BuzzFeed and that the judge only ruled this way because the judge understands that to get to the bottom of it, you have to have the government give their testimony as to what involvement they had and what they believe is true or not true. It's in the dossier. That's what the judge needs to hear. The judge needs to hear the government, someone from the government sit down and say, okay, let's have it, Mr. Comey. What is the truth about the dossier? What is true? What is false? What can you prove and what can you not prove? If you can't prove it, it ain't true. What can you prove, Mr. Comey? What can the government prove about the dossier that is true? And in this particular civil case is about Mr. Gubarev. So, can you prove, Mr. Comey, from the government, that you have evidence to prove that Mr. Gubarev's companies, XBT Holdings and Webzilla, did the hacking of the DNC? Can you prove it? That's what it's going to come down to. He's not going to be able to do that, okay? But the idea is that BuzzFeed just needs to try to create some doubt. But this is not a criminal matter. In a criminal case, it's harder to get a conviction. In a civil case, the standard or burden of proof is not that high. So I think that the argument that BuzzFeed's attorneys have been making this whole time this case has been going on, the argument that they've been making is that they were authorized and good to publish the dossier because it was newsworthy. It was newsworthy, and therefore they should be able to publish it. And the fact that Mr. Gubarev was mentioned and they didn't redact his name and they actually put his name in there is the sticky issue, because Mr. Gubarev saying, hey, you have cost me billions of dollars with my global business by naming me as being involved in this scam, which I wasn't a part of. That's libel, and I'm suing you. So I really think that BuzzFeed, as I've said all along, they're going to lose this case. They're going to lose this case. The only thing they can do is drag it out and drag it out and drag it out. And of course, BuzzFeed is being backed, I'm sure, by the deep state, probably pumping money into their legal defense, helping in every way they can, because they don't want the truth coming out in this civil case where the government has to sit down in front of a judge in a civil court and say, we can't prove the dossier is true. Christopher Steele has to sit down in front of that judge and say, I can't prove any of it's true. It's not really about BuzzFeed winning or losing the case. They're going to lose the case. That's not the point. The issue is they want to keep this, the deep state does not want this coming out, whether it's in a civil case or in a congressional hearing or anything else, until after the midterms. After the midterms. So, as you notice, the date is November. So, they have been successful in pushing it to after the midterms. That's all this was a delay tactic. Because had they not filed for this motion, this case would be convened this week, and they would be going on. And all they would have is Steele. Steele and Fusion GPS, which does not bode well, and the DNC, which does not bode very well for BuzzFeed. So this is just a delay tactic, the deep state backing BuzzFeed because they have a mutual interest in making sure the truth doesn't come out before the midterms. It isn't going to matter. After the midterms, the judge is going to learn that they have no proof, that they can't prove anything in the dossier really, other than Trump was in Moscow for the USA pageant. That's all they can really prove. No, they can't prove anything else because it's all bullshit. It's just a delay tactic. It's just a matter of time. But the fact of the matter is, the evidence and the testimony and the documents and everything that's going to come out of this, remember, the DNC has to provide all their evidence of the CrowdStrike report on their server and any other forensic evidence that they have. This is all going to come out, and it's going to be available to the Department of Justice without a subpoena, and it will probably be available for these committees in Congress looking into this, although they probably will need a subpoena. But either way, it's all coming out. Rodenstein can block all he wants in Washington, but he can't block the civil case in Florida. They can delay it, they can try to slow it down, but they can't stop it. The truth's coming out, and a lot of people are going to prison. Now, let's move on to the next topic. I told you that it's getting a little wild in this case. Hopefully I explained it well enough that it wasn't too confusing. It is a little confusing to go through. But hopefully you got a pretty good grip on what I'm talking about. Now, the American Spectator, George Neumayer. Unbelievable evidence has just come out from Mr. Neumayer. It appears that when Peters Ben Strokanus went to England, to the UK, the day after they opened the counterintelligence operation on July 31st, Operation Crossfire Hurricane, the very next day, August 1st, Peters Ben Strokanus, along with about 4 or 5 other people, went to the UK. We're now learning that one of the people that Peters Ben Strokanus did talk to when he was in the UK was Alexander Down the Hatch Downer. Yes, that's right. Peters Ben Strokanus met with Alexander Down the Hatch Downer. That's very interesting, because it was Alexander Down the Hatch Downer who had that little conversation with Papadopoulos where he claims Papadopoulos told him about the Russians having damaging material on Clinton, at which point Mr. Downer, Down the Hatch Downer, went directly to the British Embassy and fed the information through there, instead of through the normal channels that he was supposed to use for some strange reason. So that raises even more questions, but now we know for sure, because we didn't know exactly for sure who all Peters Ben Strokanus met with, but we're pretty sure that he met with, at this point we are sure that he did meet with Alexander Down the Hatch Downer. We're also pretty sure that he met with several other people, which I'll be discussing in another video after this one. So there we go. We know that Alexander Down the Hatch Downer and Peters Ben Strokanus had a meeting when they went to the UK the day after opening Crossfire Hurricane. The plot thickens, eh? Just more evidence playing into the narrative that we talk about all the time. It was a frame-up. Next up, these newly released FBI documents reveal that the FBI did pay Christopher Steele. They did pay Christopher Steele. They have not wanted to answer that question for the longest time. Christopher No Shit Sherlock Ray wouldn't answer it. No one wanted to answer it. Oh, but now Judicial Watch has got the documents. Judicial Watch has got not just the documents, they got the smoking gun document. So, newly released FBI documents reveal that the FBI did pay Christopher Steele. Not only that, they paid him 13 separate times that we know of possibly more. We also know that they met with Christopher Steele at least 12 times after the election. 12 times after the election. And of course, we know that it was from Peter's Ben Strokenes, from his testimony in Congress, that Bruce Orr was feeding information to the FBI that he was getting directly from his personal meetings with Peter's Ben Strokenes. There you go. More evidence, and the prison time just continues to add up for Peter's Ben Strokenes. Next, from Sundance at the Conservative Treehouse. Documents show from the recent FBI release that Peter's Ben Strokenes and his two cohorts, Trish Anderson and Sally Moyer, did not look at the Wiener laptop until one day. They actually didn't even look at it. It wasn't until one day later, on November 8th, the day after the election, or November 9th, the day after the election, that they actually even submitted the request form to have it gone through by Main Justice. So, Strzok lied again. There were 694,000 total communications that needed to be looked at. 350,000 emails, 344,000 BlackBerry communications. We also know from Paul Sperry's reporting about a month ago or less that Peter's Ben Strokenes had created a fake timeline to try and square things with the official testimony by Comey, Brennan, Clapper, and himself. So Strzok, Comey, and the crew are all going to be prosecuted for multiple crimes. I mean, it's just the beginning. So what are we talking about here? Well, what we're talking about is that, if you remember, they discover the Wiener laptop. McCabe is notified about it. They sit on it for 3 weeks, 3.5 weeks. This laptop has 350,000 emails from the Rotten Reverend Clinton and 344,000 BlackBerry communications. We find out from they take the laptop, the Wiener laptop, to the lab in Quantico, Virginia. And both the lab technician at Quantico, Virginia, and the case agent in the Southern District of New York have to relay back to Main Justice at the FBI, Main Justice in D.C., that they were unable to deduplicate all those emails. So going through it is going to take a long time. And so therefore, they put the laptop back into the custody of McCabe and said, well, you guys decide what to do. We're going to need a more thorough warrant, first of all, because the warrant's very limited, and you're going to need more time or something, because we can't deduplicate this. It's going to take a hell of a long time to go through all the stuff that's on that laptop, because we can't deduplicate. But Comey comes out a week before the election, and he's forced to tell us that they got this laptop with all the Rotten Reverend Clinton emails on it that belonged to Anthony Weiner, that was seized by the detectives in the Southern District of New York who were looking for dick pics. They were looking for Anthony Weiner dick pics with minors, but they find the Hillary Clinton emails and BlackBerry things. So Comey's forced to open the investigation. Then he comes back 2 or 3 days later, just, before the vote. He says, oh, okay, we've cleared the Rotten Reverend Clinton. We didn't find anything. We went through all the emails. She's good to go. Election goes ahead and goes forward. You can vote for the Rotten Reverend. She's clear. But we now know that they didn't do anything. Once that laptop was sent back to Main Justice in D.C., they didn't look at a damn thing. They couldn't. They couldn't deduplicate him at Quantico. And do you think that Peter's Ben Strokenes, Trish Anderson, and Sally Moyer, who were the only three people who had charge of that laptop, do you think they figured it out if the lab in Quantico couldn't? No, they did not. But they lied to us and said they did. The fact is, they didn't look at anything. They just went ahead and exonerated the Rotten Reverend again without looking at anything. And how do we know that? We know that because we now have the document with Peter's Ben Strokenes' request form, where he's actually signed off on the document, where he's now sending it the day after the election to be torn apart and dug into so they can look at what's on the laptop. And there's actually a box on there where it asks, has this laptop been gone through before? Or has there been any effort at this point to go through it before? And in the box that Peter Ben Strokenes signed and checked, he wrote the word none, N-O-N-E, no. Nope, they had not made any effort to get into this laptop until the day after. They lied again. Busted. Busted again. Peter's Ben Strokenes is going to jail for a long time. So is McCabe, Comey, Sally Yates, the whole damn crew. Going to be a lot of jail time. It's adding up.